Let us now turn to the Arabian Peninsula to understand some extremely consequential events in Jewish history as we look at the birth of Islam and the beginning of a major civilization within which much of Jewish history would unfold. But before we get to some of the really meaty historical elements, I'd like to begin with a prolegomenon that specifically outlines the kinds of things we should bear in mind before we approach this subject. The first of which is I'm really happy that I can use the word prolegomenon. I think it sounds so cool, but it really just basically means like kind of a preface. And so this is a preface to our study of the history of Jews in Muslim lands. Here we go. Beautiful image, by the way, in the background. 13th century Spanish representation of a Jew and a Muslim playing chess, kind of like an iconic representation of the convivencia that we'll speak about when we get to a discussion of Al-Andalus, the so-called coexistence period, which is in many ways considered the high point of Jewish-Muslim history, at least in the past. Let's hope there's another high point in the future. To really understand the 7th century context of the birth of Islam and the relationship of early Muslims to Jews, we should really look at it from the perspective of the 19th century, and in particular, a struggle for Jewish emancipation that occurred in central Germany at that time. One of the most important early scholars of the relationship of Jews to Muslims is Abraham Geiger, shown here, who's perhaps more well known as the intellectual founder of the Reform movement called Liberal in Germany. But what is perhaps less well known is the fact that he was quite a talented historian. And he came out with this book, Was hat Mohammed aus dem Judentum aufgenommen? What did Mohammed take from Judaism? What did he derive from Judaism? It was a very important, influential text, which sort of reoriented a lot of Jewish scholars to the close relationship between Muslims and Jews and Islam and Judaism that had pertained for much of the medieval period. And he really required historians to look at this period in a very different light. Now, this was one of those rare historical books that sort of seeps out past the narrow attention of historians to the broader Jewish world as a whole. And for much of the 19th century, there was kind of this unusual love affair with Islam, in particular that Spanish Golden Age that I briefly mentioned earlier, that you see in all kinds of areas of Jewish activity, such as, for example, in architecture. There's this pronounced interest in producing these kind of neoclassical synagogues that have a distinctly Moorish or Islamic feel to them, such as this remarkable Dohani synagogue in Budapest, which has these kind of Islamic-looking dual minarets that have a bit of a Slavic onion bulb look to them as well, but nevertheless very distinct. And we see this kind of architecture in America as well. Even in Yeshiva University has the same kind of feeling to it. It's all alluding to this kind of influence of Islam, or this kind of codependent influence of Judaism and Islam that was celebrated in the 19th century. By the way, since we're looking at this amazing synagogue, here's a picture of the interior with my colleague David Kraus of Prague. It's absolutely gorgeous, fantastic synagogue of the status quo movement, and I'm really looking forward to hopefully getting back there. As long as the pandemic subsides, then I'll be there, God willing, with an amazing institution called the Ashkenazium, which my colleague Dr. Michael Kegel is bringing together some amazing faculty from all around the world, including myself here in this cool picture, to talk about Jewish history and thought in Eastern Europe. It's going to be, God willing, my part will be, God willing, in October, so if you're in Budapest, please check it out. At any rate, why was this so significant for 19th century Germans in particular? Perhaps the best way to understand this is in the context of something which was called at the time the historian struggle. And the two main figures involved were Heinrich Gretz, the great encyclopedic historian of the Jews, who wrote this multi-volume history of the Jews that we've spoken about in previous classes, and this German historian, Heinrich von Treitschke, who essentially argued that the picture that Gretz was portraying of Jewish history, and especially the contrast of the experience of Jews in Islamic lands to the experience of Jews in Christian lands was completely unfounded and unfair and must be denounced. What exactly was he arguing? So Gretz, among the kind of like many thinkers of that era, the zeitgeist of the era was to look back and say, wow, look at what happened to Jews under Islamic rule, especially in Spain during those few centuries when they had tremendous freedom. Look how much they produced. Look at the poetry. Look at the philosophy. Look at the unusual, additions that they provided, how they enriched Spanish culture. Wow. It's so much worse in Christian lands, isn't it? This is essentially the argument. And it was used at the time to try and lever additional concessions from German society and government to formally emancipate the Jews. We will return to the topic of Jewish emancipation, God willing, in about a year when we get to the modern period. But in the context of the 19th century, many Jewish thinkers really look back to this golden age, which was somewhat exaggerated, as we shall see, and contrasted it unfavorably with the contemporary 19th century German experience. The great thinkers of the Spanish Golden Age were praised for their ability to be Renaissance men, so to speak, absorbing the influences of Islam and of Judaism and of philosophy and of mysticism and creating these wonderful, literary works. And the implication was, Germany, you should be allowing the Jews to do this as well. Now, Heinrich von Treitschke said totally unfair. He said that the Jews have only brought negative things to Germany. He coined the notorious slur against Jews, which would later be used by Adolf Hitler, Die Juden sind unser Unglück. The Jews are our misfortune. So it is in this context that we have to look backwards at the Muslim period. The idea of looking at the Muslim period as an ideal one is something that was heavily leaned upon in the 19th century, but it went through a reversal when we get to the late 19th and especially early 20th century. This idea of a coexistence between Muslim and Jews, which definitely has its basis in reality, however exaggerated in 19th century thought, was questioned by Jewish historians, particularly when we get to the 20th century. And here we see, the influence of contemporary politics often distorts the historical record, or the way we approach the historical record. And this is undoubtedly due to the conflict that was exacerbated by the growth of the Zionist movement and the growing immigration to Israel, which to a certain degree inflamed conflict with local populations in the land of Israel and in the region as a whole. Many of these Muslim populations were just beginning to go through their national reawakening, something that had occurred in Eastern Europe 100, 200 years earlier and was now catching up to the Middle East, and they began to see these Jewish immigrants as somehow interlopers and as somehow upsetting the status quo in a very negative way. And of course, we will explore this, God willing, when we get to the modern period, but there was significant conflict between the indigenous population, Arab immigrants to the region because of increased economic activity, and the flow of Jewish immigration to the land of Israel. And so many Jewish historians began to question that 19th century model, saying, was it really so wonderful in the ancient world? Did Jews really do so better under Islam? The kind of areas that we see focused on in 20th century historiography emphasizes the really pretty brutal period of conflict in early Islam, which we're going to look at in the very next video, and tries to reevaluate how do we understand their experience under Muslim rule. Bernard Lewis, very important 20th century historian who looked at this period, he says in a very moderate way, he says, look, Jews in Muslim lands, quote, were never free from discrimination, but were only rarely subject to persecution. This is, I think, a fairly temperate way to characterize several centuries of Jewish experience in Muslim lands. And when you compare it, pound for pound, incident for incident, there's no question that the moments of violence that punctuated Jewish-Muslim relationships was nothing compared to the same thing we would find in Christian Europe, as we shall explore over the course of this semester. He also said, and this is also a helpful kind of way of thinking about the period, it was never as bad in Muslim lands as it was in Christendom when Christendom was at its worst, nor, on the other hand, was it ever as good for Jews in Muslim lands as it was in Christendom when it was at its best. And I think that's a fairly moderate and even-toned way to characterize these centuries. In other words, in Muslim lands, as the British historian Martin Gilbert put it, there was no Inquisition, there was no Holocaust, but at the same time, Jews never achieved the same level of full legal emancipation and broad acceptance that they would, for example, in England or in France. So this is kind of like a broad way to compare the experience of the Jews under the crescent, that is in Muslim lands, and under the cross, that is in Christian lands. One of the greatest living historians of this period and this topic is Professor Mark Cohen, who has done a lot of really valuable work looking at the comparative experience of Jews in Muslim and Christian lands. And he proposes there are 5 main categories that really explain much of the difference between the experience in these two areas. And let's look at them very quickly before we go to the actual history in the next video. The first is we should understand that the nature of anti-Jewish antipathy in Christian lands is of a highly distinct character when compared to that in Muslim lands. Recall that Christianity is born from Judaism directly, that there is that special mother-daughter relationship which can have an unusual level of acrimony, particularly when the daughter religion tries to articulate how it is different than the mother religion. And we saw a lot of that, for example, when we looked at the work of the Church Fathers. Islam is kind of like a granddaughter religion. It occurs 6 centuries later, and it doesn't necessarily have the same kind of need to distance itself from Judaism that Christianity did. It's a very significant theological point that colored much of the period we're discussing. Secondly, we're talking about very different kind of socioeconomic structures. In Europe, you have a form of feudalism that has competing centers of power. The church is a very powerful center, particularly at certain periods like the 13th century, and the king is very powerful at other periods. And sometimes the king's interests vis-a-vis the Jews do not coincide with the church's interest, and depending on which power is stronger and in which region, that can pull the Jews in one direction or another. The nobility is also very significant. Sometimes the kings do not have absolute power vis-a-vis their nobility, and so Jews can often find themselves pulled in different directions. This is not the same kind of social structure that pertains in Muslim lands, and as a result, much of that uncertainty and, for example, a propensity for expelling the Jews does not exist in the same way in Muslim lands. Third, Christian lands often have special economic restrictions applied to Jews, such as exclusion from certain guilds, the maintenance of particular charters that regulate what kind of economic activities Jews can engage in a particular location. These things do not necessarily pertain in Muslim lands. Fourth, there is a much higher level of social exclusion in Christian lands. Again, we're speaking in generalities here, but the barrier between Jews and Christians in the social realm seems to be much higher and more durable in Christian lands than it is in Muslim lands. And finally, in Europe, you begin to see the gradual expansion of what I'd like to call an ethnic proto-nationalism. It's too early in the medieval period to really speak about nationalism, which is essentially a modern phenomenon, but the growing sense of the strength of larger regional identities which will ultimately find its fuller expression in nationalism, begins earlier in Christian lands. And this affects the Jews because are they considered part of this proto-national identity? In Muslim lands, you don't necessarily have this same growth of that specific regional identity. You have much more of a pan-Islamic, sometimes pan-Arabic identity, and Jews are much more included within that model than they would be in the European model. So these are 5 factors that serve to distinguish the experience of Jews in Muslim lands from the experience of Jews in Christian lands. And as we go through the next few lectures, hopefully this will become much more apparent. The golden age in Spain really was a golden age. There were phenomenal things to see in that period, and I'm looking forward to speaking with you about it shortly, but nevertheless, placed within the larger context, hopefully these ideas will give us a better sense of how to fairly characterize the relative experience in these 2 realms of Jewish history. Wow, so much talking. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Let's go now to look at the experience of Jews in the Arabian Peninsula at the time of the birth of Islam. Thank you for watching.